Dr. Colby talks about an idea that he calls differentiated credibility. We need to be more powerful in one region than another. The United States has always been a global power. And so I would like to see a national security strategy, defense strategy, and a maritime strategy that maintains our global interests. We talk about the commons, all over the world. I don't want us to become just a regional power out in the Western Pacific and give up everything else. But it really becomes a matter of money, right? And what we really need here, my conclusion is we need more Navy. And of course. I'm sure there are others on the Hill that would agree with me on that. Hello, everyone. This is Admiral Jamie Foggo from the Center for Maritime Strategy of the Navy League of the United States, just outside Washington, D.C. You're listening to Maritime Nation, the Center for Maritime Strategy's podcast designed to dive deeply into the policy challenges facing America's sea services and the role of the United States as a sea power on the global stage. Thank you to Dataminr for sponsoring Season 4 of Maritime Nation. We're honored today to be joined by CMS's own Dr. Steve Wills and Sam Byers. And this is coincident with the current strategy forum, which is happening right now in Newport, Rhode Island at the Naval War College. Dr. Wills serves as our navalist for the Center for Maritime Strategy of the Navy League of the United States. He's an expert in U.S. Navy strategy and policy and U.S. Navy surface warfare programs and platforms. Dr. Wills had a 20-year career as an active duty U.S. naval officer and served in a variety of small and medium surface combatants, including an assignment as the executive officer of a mine countermeasure ship. He also held shore-based billets at the Defense Intelligence Agency and the NATO Joint Force Maritime Component Command in Naples, Italy. After retiring from the Navy in 2010, he completed a master's and a PhD in history with a concentration on military history at Ohio University, graduating in 2017. Dr. Wills is the author of Strategy Shelved: The Collapse of the Cold War Naval Strategic Planning, published by the Naval Institute Press in July 2021, and as an author with former Secretary of the Navy John Lehman, Steve wrote Where Are the Carriers? U.S. National Strategy and Choices Ahead, published by the Foreign Policy Research Institute in August 2021. Most recently, Steve has been our editor-in-chief of our first volume here from the Center of Maritime Strategy, entitled Returning from Ebb Tide, Renewing the United States Commercial Maritime Enterprise, which CMS published with the Marine Corps University Press. To my right, Mr. Sam Byers is the Senior National Security Advisor at the Center for Maritime Strategy. Sam served for 2 years as a civilian analyst on the staff of the Secretary of the Navy, where he conducted research and analysis to support the Department of the Navy's strategic goals. He has also previously worked for the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, and covered the defense and national security portfolio for the Vandenberg Coalition. We were lucky to bring him over here to the Center for Maritime Strategy. Sam holds a master's in arts with distinction from the War Studies Department at King's College London, where his dissertation research focused on the politics behind the construction of America's all-steel Navy in the 1880s and the 1890s. He graduated from the University of Pennsylvania with degrees in diplomatic history and political science prior to that. Gentlemen, welcome to the Maritime Nation podcast.
Glad to be here, sir.
Thanks, sir. Good to be here as
Great
always.
to have you both. Now, like I said, I just returned from the current strategy forum at the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island, as a guest of my classmate, Dean Mike Sherlock, in the International Studies program and the strategy program, and Rear Admiral Darrell Walker, D-Day, call sign D-Day Walker, who was a participant in our last Sea Air Space Symposium. Now, let me tell you the theme for the current strategy forum at the Naval War College this year. It's short. It's the future of sea power, maritime strategy, and naval warfare, and defined by As we approach the fourth decade of the 21st century, the dominant geopolitical competition centers around the contrasting goals of the United States and China. The looming question is whether China will be successful in challenging the post-World War II American-led international order and replace the United States as the world's dominant superpower. Well, our motto on our coin for the Center for Maritime Strategy is Semper Invictus, which means always undefeated. And the three gentlemen in these chairs intend for that not to happen. So today we want to talk about the current strategy forum, maritime strategy, and how we could put the lessons of Mahan to work for the United States Navy. Now, I gave a keynote yesterday, and this was all done in the context of great books on maritime strategy. I just want to tell you a couple of those that I put up on the screen. There were 8 total, but I won't go through all of them. One, of course, Strategy, a History by Sir Lawrence Freedman, who is a friend who helped me with maritime strategy back in 2015. The Neptune Factor, Alfred Thayer Mahan and the Concept of Sea Power by Dr. Nicholas Lambert, a fantastic book based on a study he did for the Pentagon years ago, and it's won awards. Ocean's Venture from John Lehman about his award-winning Cold War strategy, the maritime strategy of 1986. The Strategy of Denial by Dr. Bridge Colby, who's also a friend and a friend of the center, and has written about what's going to happen in the next couple of years in the Western Pacific. And we need to pay attention to that because many of you probably know that Dr. Colby was confirmed as the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy in this administration. He's been there for a couple of months. And our own Strategy Shelf by Dr. Wills, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. Returning from Ebb Tide was, of course, on the list. And finally, Jellicoe's War by another good friend of the center, Nick Jellicoe, the grandson of Admiral Lord Jellicoe. One of the things I talked about was the first current strategy forum that I attended at the War College was in 2007. And it was to launch CS21, the Cooperative Strategy for the 21st Century, championed by Admiral Mike Mullen and Vice Admiral John Morgan. Prior to that, Admiral Mullen put resources in N35, where Admiral Morgan worked, to conduct a conversation with the country. And I was lucky to participate in a couple of those out in Chicago, San Francisco, New York City. We went also to Portland, Oregon, down to Miami, and had a conversation with the American people. This wasn't Fleet Week. This was an opportunity for the American people to hear from a Vice Admiral in the United States Navy, John Morgan, where we were headed, what direction we were headed in with CS21 and maritime strategy, and they got a chance to feed that back. So today we kind of revived that. It hasn't happened since then. We revived that conversation with the country through the Maritime Nation podcast. So I'm going to ask these two naval experts sitting on either side of me today a couple of questions. Before we dive, gentlemen, into maritime strategy specifically, let's take a step back. How do you two define strategy in general, and what are the different levels of strategy? Grand strategy, Sam, you've studied this, at King's College, Steve in Ohio. Military strategy, both operational and tactical. How do they relate to one another? And then we'll get into maritime strategy. Let me start with you, Steve.
Hey, thank you very much, sir. So my source for a definition of strategy comes from an unlikely place, from sort of a Navy hater, but I think he had some good things to say, and this is Ambassador Robert Comer, who was the Carter administration's Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, the same position that Bridge Colby occupies now. And Comer's definition of strategy was the pragmatic interface of policy and resources, because as Admiral Foggo was explaining the levels of strategy, the further you get away from the tactical level, the less dependent on mathematics and logic you get, and you have to make some assumptions. So real quick, sir, to your question about the relationship, the great naval tactics expert at the Naval Postgraduate School, Captain Wayne Hughes, once said that to know tactics, you must know technology. So at the tactical level, it's very much about math, being able to calculate, where do I aim a torpedo so it can hit an enemy surface ship, et cetera. This is math driven. But as you move to the campaign level of war, where you're talking about multiple battlefronts potentially, and all the way to a strategic level that might involve a whole section of the globe or the globe itself, it becomes much less, not so much less logical, but more of a pragmatic nature where you have to think about it. The levels are all also directly interrelated. Good example of this, go back to Iraq War II, 2003. Saddam Hussein's spokesperson, Baghdad Bob, was on TV talking about how his forces were repulsing Americans and coalition forces everywhere. But then all of a sudden video appears of American, I think it was Marines or soldiers, deep inside Baghdad pulling down a statue of Saddam Hussein. And this appeared immediately on global television. This is a very tactical event. A non-commissioned officer and his small group of soldiers or Marines, but that act had strategic implications as it showed that everything Saddam's spokesperson was saying was a load of BS. So the levels are all related. What happens at the tactical level can influence all the way to the strategic level, and strategic decisions impact tactics as well. What if you ban the use of cluster munitions or mines or some other weapon? That could have tactical implications. So all interrelated together.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that example, Steve, of Iraq, and it brought to mind one of my friends, General Dave Perkins, who was the Army TRADOC commander. But Dave was the first tank in Baghdad as a colonel. We served together in the Pentagon, and then he went off to the campaign. They wrote a book about that called Thunder Run. And as Baghdad Bob was broadcasting, there are no Americans in Baghdad. Here comes a M1 Abrams tank commanded by Dave turning around the corner. And that was just, it was serious, but it was also comical. Okay, over to you, Sam. What do you have to say about grand strategy, military strategy, and maritime strategy?
Sure. So there are a lot of, I think, great definitions out there for what strategy is. I think people would be familiar with the, kind of some of the high level ones. The harmonization of ends, ways, and means is a good one. I'm always partial to history told in advance. You're kind of writing the story of what you want to happen. But my definition of my own personal devising that I tend to use is strategy being the application of reason to circumstance and passion in pursuit of a defined aim. And the reason I like this one, and I've kind of settled on it, is I think it's important to remember that strategy is a process of mind. It's something that you do. It's not something that you write down. The writing down is that's an important component of it. A written strategy is an important planning and messaging tool, but strategy itself is something that occurs in your head between your two ears. And it evolves as you come into contact with different circumstances, and then circumstances being kind of the wide range of what you have, what your adversary has, the terrain, the natural factors outside of your control. Strategy evolves as it comes into contact with circumstances, but it's also about the interplay of the interior passions of the strategist. What do you want to do? What are you thinking of? What might you get distracted by? What are the people under your command? What are they likely to get to want or to be driven off course by? And you're trying to marshal these two forces, these two outside forces, and through reason and the application of will, harmonize them towards a defined aim. And that's I think the last important thing. You can't have a strategy without a goal. And I think we're going to come back to this later. Oftentimes here in DC, I hear people say, "Oh, well, we need a strategy for this." This is very common, on Capitol Hill and the Pentagon. So it's real important that we have a strategy, but we're not going to give you a goal, and you're not allowed to come up with a goal. And without a goal, there's no strategy. That doesn't make any sense. It's a complete non sequitur, or a dead end rather. And then, lastly, to your point about kind of the levels of war, I think it's important to think about how I'll draw the line between strategy and kind of the operational tactics, campaign art. I draw a line between those. Rather, some people put it between grand strategy and strategy, but I'll draw it a little lower. Strategy has an inherently political quality about it. Strategy is about one, you have to define those aims, and those are often non-military aims. Those are political aims. And two, there's an element of taking open-ended risk that is inherent to strategy and grand strategy that can't be subordinated down into a military command structure. It has to do with more of a, entirety of government, political level decision making. Yeah. So I think that's an important thing to distinguish and an important thing to lay out.
Yeah, and I know both of you have read and are big fans of Lawrence Freedman's book, Strategy. I'm sure he probably taught at King's College while you were there.
He had just retired when I was over there.
Yeah, still just a massive intellect on strategy. And I brought him up at the Naval War College because Lawrence Freedman has a refreshing look on strategy. His book is thick, but it's entertaining. I actually read the whole thing cover to cover and used it in my own thinking when I was on active duty in the Navy. He writes about ant colonies having a strategy. There are worker ants, there are soldier ants, and both have their duties. One defends the turf, the other one builds the mounds, feeds the queen. It never occurred to me until I read his book that Moses had a strategy against the Pharaoh, and we all know Moses won, right? But the nice thing about it was I'd always heard in the Joint Operational Planning and Evaluation System and all my training in the Pentagon schools and application of strategy and campaign plans that, strategy is about ends, ways, and means. You brought that up. He looks at it through a couple of different lenses. Yes, you can bend strategy into ends, ways, means, ends, whatever order you want to put them in. But strategy is also about, testing a plan when you go on the field. This is a von Moltke, no plan survives first contact with the enemy. And I think throughout my life, whenever we did an exercise or an operation, I've been involved in combat operations and significant exercises like Trident Juncture with 50,000 troops. You kind of test things out, and then you modify your plan. And the opening page of the book has one quote, and it's from Mike Tyson. And it says, you think you have a plan, and then you get punched in the face. And the purpose of a good, solid strategy, like the Maritime Strategy of 1986, is to make sure that you don't get punched in the face. You can adapt and overcome some of the moves that the enemy's going to make. So this is a really important discussion. While I was at the War College, I brought up a friend and a gentleman who's just an incredible thinker and a writer, and that is Dr. Nick Lambert, who has published the new book, The Neptune Factor, award-winning factor. And it's about Mahan. It challenges some of the traditional assumptions about Mahan. And I can tell you that, I read the 12th edition of The Influence of Sea Power Upon History when I was at the Naval Academy as a plebe, and I didn't understand any of it. We talked about it in history class, and everybody said, well, Mahan is a genius and the father of sea power. And who was I as a midshipman to question that? I didn't really get clarity until I had a tutor in the form of Nick Lambert and his writings and his readings. And I actually reviewed one of his books, The Warlords and the Gallipoli Campaign, and he asked me to take a look at this big paper that eventually became, it was derived to produce the Neptune Factor. And so some of the things that he points out, I think, are telling and compelling. First of all, he maintains that, Mahan is often misunderstood. He quotes Jeffrey Till by saying, Mahan suffers from having written more than people are prepared to read. And that Mahan had an evolution of thought too, and that's the mark of a good man and a strategist, to say, hey, I've made some assumptions, maybe I'm wrong. As I study and read more, or I apply strategy more, I learn and adapt. And so that's to Mahan's great credit. Mahan asserted sea power is not only important in time of war, but also in time of peace. And he points out that Samuel Huntington didn't see it that way. That was a bit of a surprise to me. I like Mahan and Lambert's underscoring of the trifecta. It's all about commerce, wealth, and power. In fact, after reading Lambert, I'm convinced more that Mahan was a political economist as much as a naval strategist, because he believes sea power is more commercial than military, and this plays out throughout his writings. A couple of other observations. In order to protect the source of that commercial wealth, you've got to have a strong Navy, which is why I think our founding fathers wrote in the Constitution that we will maintain a Navy but raise an Army. So we should also always have a strong Navy. The 7 seas are connected by the global common. That's typical Mahanian thought and phrase. and access is more important than control of the commons, and navies ensure access. And Dr. Lambert underscores that. Mahan believed in the power of sea lines of communication for one's own country and the ability to use that against an adversary. He didn't believe, this was an assumption that I made, and I was wrong. I thought Mahan was all about great battles at sea, wars of annihilation. Not true. He was more, in Lambert's interpretation, about wars of attrition. And you don't need to, you need to restrict the enemy's ability to have access to the commons and sea lines of communication, but you don't necessarily have to destroy the enemy's commerce in order to do that. And there's numerous examples throughout history, particularly in the Napoleonic Wars with Great Britain and in the War of 1812, of how the British mastered that. So all of those things, I think, are important for us to remember in the 21st century as we apply the still relevant principles of Mahan to warfighting today. So for you two gentlemen, let me move on from Mahan and into a comparison between Mahan and Corbett. So what's your take, Steve? What are the differences between the two men, and what are the similarities? And then we'll go over to Sam.
Hey, thanks, sir. No, I think there are a lot more similarities between the two, really, than differences. They're both products of their respective geopolitical environments. And as you pointed out, sir, Mahan is writing over a long period from 1890 into the beginning of World War I. And a lot geopolitically happens in that period for the United States. We go from being a continental power that's worried about foreign fleets descending upon us, whether it's the British or the Imperial Germans, to the point just before World War I, where we are a mini colonial power in our own right, much more concerned about sea lines of communication. And there's always a close relationship, I think, between British and American sea power at this time. Mahan himself looked upon Britain and the United States as being sort of a cooperative Anglo-American sea power effort. And that's why you have this great focus upon sea lines of communication and commerce. At this point, up until really the beginning of World War I, the United States is not really able to defend its own commerce fully itself, and really does rely upon the British, who are deployed globally. The British created a lot of our modern sort of globalization, pre-World War I globalization tools, Admiralty law, Admiralty courts, the worldwide system of undersea cables for communicating information.
Right.
So the United States becomes dependent, not really dependent, but a sort of a co-belligerent in pulling all this together and being supported by it. Corbett, too, is a product of his geopolitical situation, in which case the British Army and the Royal Navy had worked very closely together for the preceding 100 years in the post-Napoleonic period. As one of Corbett's good friends and facilitators, crazy Admiral Jackie Fisher, once said, the British Army is a projectile to be fired ashore by the Royal Navy. And going all the way back to early operations in India, where the very sadly benighted General Cornwallis, who got beat at Yorktown because the Royal Navy couldn't come and pick him up and move him again. The British developed this very successful set of operations where the Royal Navy moves the British Army around to mutual strategic effect. And Corbett writes about this, and that important. He's sort of an early joint writer in terms of working together with Army and Navy. So the two men, and they were friends, and they exchanged correspondence, and they were not opposed to each other. So I think they well represent their geopolitical environments that they're coming from, and they work rather well cooperatively together up to the point of the First World War. And both of them sadly are gone by the end of that conflict.
1914, that's right.
Exactly.
Yeah, before that war really got off, and before the Battle of Jutland, which would have been interesting to hear his theories on that. Sam, how about you? Mahan and Corbett. What do you have to say?
So, sir, you mentioned earlier about, kind of the misconception that I think a lot of people have of Mahan being about fleet battle and Corbett being about other things, and guerre de course and blockade and joint operations with the Army. And I think the important thing to keep in mind is, there are several. The first one is sea power and maritime strategy inherently and uniquely compared to certain other types and domains of strategy has a multi-phase approach, right? You have to seize command and then you have to exploit it. One or the other is not sufficient. And so we tend to draw the seizing command out of Mahan and the exploiting command out of Corbett, but really both of them talk about both. And like Steve mentioned, these guys are contemporaries. They know each other. They correspond. They're in dialogue with each other. And so another important thing to remember is when we're talking about influence of sea power, we're basically reading the first thing Mahan ever wrote in the 1880s, around about 1890. We're reading Principles of Maritime Strategy. We're reading close to the last thing Corbett ever wrote 30 odd years later. And both of them, like Steve mentioned, are writing over this whole period of time. So you're actually, I think with Corbett, you're getting a much more refined body of thought. And if you go to some of the later Mahan, and Lambert's book is very good at drawing this out, Mahan later on is writing about a lot of the same things. How do you leverage command of the sea for your economic benefit? How do you how do you exploit this? And so this division that people draw sometimes, I think, is overwrought. And they're tackling the same body of problems from two different angles. Again, just to drive home another of Steve's points, Mahan is writing for a continental empire that's an upstart at sea. Corbett is, and so he's focused on seizing command of the sea. How do you seize this for the United States or prevent it from being used against us? Certainly in his early writing. Corbett, by contrast, he lives in, the high Victorian, the Edwardian British sea power state. It's a great maritime empire in its own right. You don't need to seize command of the sea if you're the Royal Navy. You already have it. The question is, what do you do with it? And that's how to think about kind of the division between the two of them, which really isn't as much of a division as people present it.
Hey, great analysis. Thanks very much for that. And, of course, going back to the theme of the current strategy forum up at the Naval War Colleges, well, how are we utilizing these theories and all this extensive study and writing on maritime strategy in the 21st century? And I'll tell you that the War College does some great work up there. They've got a place that's called the Center for China Maritime Studies Institute, headed by Dr. Andrew Erickson. And they had their annual conference a few weeks ago and published a quick look report on the 15th of May. And I'll just give you some observations of this contest between the United States and China in the maritime in the eyes of those very intelligent people that make up CMSI, and then those that they bring in to be kind of ad hoc contributors to the annual program. First and foremost, in the quick look, Xi Jinping is a navalist. Now, who'd have thought that? He's also a Navy lobby of one. And Xi Jinping had a conversation with President Trump last Thursday for 90 minutes. On Xi's opener, he made a metaphor to the fact that, hey, President Trump, you and I are the captains of two great ships, and we need to be careful how we maneuver out in that global common so we don't run into each other. So I thought that was very interesting. It's obvious that Xi has read Mahan. Xi has biased the PLA Navy towards production of high-end platforms, including aircraft carriers. They're on their third, so they bought an old carrier, refurbished it. They built another one to look like it, the Liaoning, and the second carrier is a jump jet carrier, so it's vertical takeoff and landing. They have a third carrier, Fujian, which has got tents over top of the deck, and the speculation is they might have the electromagnetic assisted launch, which took us generations to get to on the Ford-class carriers. How they got it so quickly is a matter of speculation, but we don't even know if it's going to work. But China is putting resources into the Navy, and that's being driven by Xi Jinping. Also, nuclear-powered submarines, ballistic missile and attack submarines, and lots of hybrid diesel-electric submarines, and a surface fleet that is impressive. Cruisers, destroyers, they're up to a Luoyang Flight 3. I've been on the Luoyang 1 before. The Renhai class cruiser looks a lot like our Ticonderoga class cruiser and is a very effective ship with all sorts of weapon systems in multi-mission areas, and frigates. And they're producing frigates at the rate of about one a year, which is, per shipyard, which is beating our shipyards in production. She's also put a lot of money into an anti-access area denial strategy. So they have a long-range precision strike system and a strategic rocket force that is pretty impressive and a little scary. DF-17 is the hypersonic. We don't have a hypersonic. The Russians do, the Chinese do, we don't. We're going to get one soon. We're testing. DF-21, DF-26, ballistic missiles known as the carrier killers. That causes us pause in operating in the weapons exclusion zone, which is really, we used to operate with impunity in the second and the first island chains around China. Now we have to be more circumspect and more careful. And then China has an outstanding STEM education system in the provinces, so they don't have any problem recruiting sailors and conscripting sailors to the Navy, which is growing leaps and bounds. Admiral Cottle was up at Fleet Week when I was there a couple of weeks ago, and he was asked on Fox News, hey, the Chinese have surpassed the number of 400 warships today. And to our less than 300, our goal is 381 crewed and another 134 uncrewed for a total of 515 vessels in the U.S. Navy. But we're nowhere near that number. And Admiral Cottle tried to explain that there is a certain quality to quantity, but there's also a certain quality to quality. And we know that our ships are, they better perform, and our sailors are better performers. And we're proven in combat in the Red Sea. Finally, and sadly, it looks like the PLA Navy has been told to prepare for war with the United States and the United States Navy. So with that as a backdrop, this discussion of maritime strategy is extremely important. You are listening to Maritime Nation, the Center for Maritime Strategy's podcast designed to dive deeply into the policy challenges facing America's sea services and the role of the United States as a sea power on the global stage. We aim to provide you with the highest quality analysis on the most pressing maritime security challenges by joining in conversation with key experts and practitioners. This season is produced with support from Dataminr. Dataminr is recognized as one of the world's leading AI businesses. The company's clients are the first to know about high-impact events and emerging risks so they can mitigate and manage crises more effectively. Dataminr solutions are relied on 24/7 by hundreds of clients, including the Department of Defense, in over 100 countries across 6 continents to help them solve real-world problems. Here at CMS, our whole team uses Dataminr's First Alert to stay up to date on breaking news or crises that impact our national security or the security of our allies and partners. So as we go through all this, I would ask you to, first of all, any opinions on that, on CMSI's conclusions, on the current tension with China? Are we ready for a conflict in 2027? Let me go to Sam this time, first a responder. Sam, what about you?
Sure. I think it's pretty sobering, and that is in line with what I've seen, written elsewhere by analysts who I trust and who have a good track record. The thing that I would add to that is, and it gets at the crux of kind of what's a maritime strategy, what's a naval strategy. We approach this in a very Navy forward and defense forward way. That's kind of our mindset when we think about the possibility of conflict with China. And that's not to discount that at all, right? That's a very serious, in many ways, the most serious possible outcome. But we have to be careful not to get fixated on possible war with China or possible war over Taiwan as the only scenario to be thinking about to the exclusion of others. And so I'd add to kind of CMSI's analysis, the other side of it is it's not just the PLAN. It's you have to think about the Chinese Coast Guard, which is now one of the largest, if not the largest in the world.
Force multiplier.
Force multiplier, a maritime militia that is embedded in the Chinese merchant fleet, and then a Chinese merchant fleet that's built by Chinese shipyards, crewed by Chinese sailors and officers, operates around the world. And then Chinese state-owned and corporate penetration into the infrastructure of shipyards and logistics chains around the world, including in the United States. And so what I would posit with this is you have to also be really concerned about China just leapfrogging over the seize command of the seas phase and straight to the exploitation phase. Because you can envision a scenario where, we have, leverage over the commercial maritime system such that we, without firing a shot or without, going to war with the United States, we can threaten and cajole people to impose an embargo on the United States and say, Maersk, Hapag-Lloyd, if you ever want to buy a ship from Chinese yards again and not have things that are in our shipyards repossessed today, you'll stop doing business with the United States. And if you call any ship line that calls on a port that, an American port, will never again call on a port that we own a controlling interest in around the world. Or our maritime militia will go after, American, ships owned by American allies or flagged with American allies around the world.
That's a Garrett, of course.
Right. You don't have to do the Mahanian decisive battle to start doing the exploitation of sea control if, as the Chinese today have such a commanding position in the commercial maritime world, that gives you enough, that could give you enough leverage to just jump right to the exploitation phase and start really turning the screws on us in ways that sending a carrier strike group to the Western Pacific isn't going to counter that. It's a very thorny problem. So I caution people to think about that in addition to how will we defend Taiwan and how will we, fight inside the first island chain. That's one very important problem, but it is certainly not the only one.
Well stated, Sam. And you bring up all sorts of concerns and things that we ought to be thinking about, which, is the reason why we need a comprehensive maritime strategy. Now, inside the Beltway, we hear rumors that there will be a national security strategy by early fall, followed by a national defense strategy. And it's my hope that whoever it is that comes in as the new chief of naval operations will move beyond nav plans, which is what the last two CNOs embraced, and instead come up with a comprehensive maritime strategy that dovetails nicely with the NSS and the NDS, the future NSS and NDS that are coming out. So that brings me to the point of who are the main strategic audiences for U.S. maritime strategy today? Is it the Congress? Is it the American people? Is it our allies, our adversaries? I mean, Congress is controlling the purse strings, and they've certainly been generous, and we're looking at close to $1 trillion defense budget. But how should we be communicating the need for a robust maritime strategy with these audiences? This is getting back to the conversation with the country. Are we doing that effectively? Should we do more of it? And of course, I'm always drawn back to the strategic concept from Samuel Huntington's Transoceanic Navy's essay and proceedings of 50 years ago. And the reason that the American people will agree to support a Navy, in other words, taxpayers pay for a Navy, is because we have a strategic concept that is relevant and matters. So, Steve, let me start with you.
Sure.
Who are the main audiences for maritime strategy?
Maritime strategy documents, and especially the force structures that go along with them, have always been used as good communication tools, going back to certainly the 19th century. As you get to the end of the 19th century, there's a lot of concern in Great Britain at that time that the Royal Navy is sort of a rusty trident. It's been decades and decades since it, locked horns with the French or anybody else. There's been no great power maritime wars. The Royal Navy is sort of a hodgepodge of different technological ships from different eras. And you get to 1889 and there's a press campaign that says the Royal Navy is not ready for war with a rising France and Russian Navy, and you got to get ready. So the British Parliament passes the Naval Defence Act of 1889. That's a massive building program, involves 2 whole classes of battleships, cruisers, destroyers, all kinds of stuff. And it's a powerful message. And along with it goes Britain's sort of unofficial policy of the 2-power standard. The Royal Navy is going to be bigger and more powerful than the next 2 navies beneath us. So this is an example of the kind of powerful strategic communication that you need to accomplish. The Maritime Strategy, the 1980s, written by folks in OpNav, heavily promoted and with deep intellectual background from John Layman, made the same goal. We are going to use the maritime spaces to best affect a potential conflict with the Soviet Union. We're going to act on the flanks of our opponent so that they will be distracted from their mission, presumably of invading Germany and the rest of Western Europe. So we've done this in the past. We need to do this again. And we've got some useful tools. I think CMSI's points that they've raised are a valuable part of this. And the War College has always been an important partner with the Navy in building strategy, going all the way back to the beginning of the 20th century, and even before that. So the War College is this intellectual home, and their opinion matters, and what CMSI is saying is of vital importance here. China, obviously she is a navalist. Lots of people have read Mahan before. Kaiser Wilhelm II had copies printed in German and handed out and put in every wardroom of every ship in the high seas fleet.
Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So there is a desire to read the great man's work and get it out there. And I agree with you, sir, that she is definitely a disciple here. We've got some interesting dynamics going, and a lot of it is like the German high seas fleet before World War I. We've got a very powerful, but yet still very regional Chinese Navy. It does not deploy 1/3 of its force globally the way the United States does. And we can talk about that at some point as either being a detriment or a benefit, because you're not beating your ships up. But China is focused in its region, very much so. It's not deploying outside. So as you point out, sir, and as Sam did, you can make threats and say, look, we own the maritime infrastructure. If you do business with the United States, you're going to be shut out. One of Nick Lambert's other great books that talks about this is Planning Armageddon. The Brits were going to do this at the outset of World War I, use their control of the maritime system to collapse Germany really at the outset of World War I without landing any troops whatsoever. Really the act of a maritime nation in waging war. But they couldn't make it work. Too many fights from neutrals, especially the United States, who said, hey, you can't do this to us. So there is a powerful sense of nationality in the world in terms of, hey, this is my trade, I'm part of your trade, but don't muscle in on me. So our strategy ought to communicate things like that this is a global effort. One nation doesn't control it all. You know, we provide benevolent support to this system. They'll want to take it over and make it into mercantilism. So to conclude, what you said about strategy is absolutely vital, sir. It's got to be a communication tool. It has to communicate our intent, but also the force structure we put behind it says a lot, whether that's battleships, aircraft carriers, unmanned units with lots of missiles, more submarines, it all matters.
Wow. Hey, well, I was writing some things down while you were speaking about the Germans and Tirpitz and the Germans translating Mahan and putting it in every wardroom on a ship. Many years ago, when I led the discussion with the PLA Navy, and the chief of the PLA Navy, the CNO, was Admiral Wu Shangli. He told me that he was translating and going to put a copy of Command at Sea from the Naval Institute on every ship in the United States Navy. And that's how they learned. That's how they learned to become a Navy. They learned from us. And there's nothing you can do about that. It's open literature, but I'm sure they violated tons of copyrights.
Absolutely.
That's what they do. And I want to underscore the point of the Naval War College and bringing them in on this. Sam, over to you. Who's the audience and why is that important?
Yeah. I mean, the answer to your question is all of the above, right?
Yeah.
It's,
I think so. Yeah.
It's not just the military, but it's Congress, but it's the public at large, other policymakers, the business community. I'm going to throw two other great strategic thinkers who we've talked about before. Throw out two. One is J.C. Wiley, who I think we've mentioned, a mid-century American admiral who served in World War II and then got around to writing at the Naval War College after the war. He has an excellent book called On Military Strategy, a theory of power control that I'm currently working my way through. Again, it's short, but it's very, very insightful. But one of the points that he makes very clearly up front is he says, this is not a military discipline. This is an everyone discipline. And it gets to what I was saying kind of up at the top of the hour, that this is an intellectual and political discipline. It's not just something that militaries do. In a free country, in a republic, your leadership has to make these decisions, has to think about these decisions. Members of Congress, the president, the president's advisors, and the people who elect them have to be able to think about this, or at least have an idea about these strategic questions. Because when Congress votes on budgets, they're making strategic decisions. When Congress sets goals for the Pentagon, they're making strategic decisions, and likewise from the White House. So it is an all of the above question. And then on the flip side of that, I'll throw out for kind of folks in the Pentagon, folks in the Navy, Sam Huntington's National Policy in the Transoceanic Navy, which you mentioned, Admiral, is another excellent essay. I would argue it's still deep in the DNA of how the Navy sees itself, how the Pentagon sees the Navy. And it articulates the idea of what do you do with the United States Navy in a world where there are no more navies left to fight, which is, he's writing right after the Korean War. The United States commands all the seas. What do you do with the Navy in that situation? He devises this idea of the Transoceanic Navy based on, in part, on the experience of the Korean War. But the important thing that Huntington lays out right at the front is he says there are three elements to a military service. There's a strategic concept, there's your men and your materiel, and then there's how you organize them. And the most important one is the strategic concept, because the other two flow from that. If you don't know what you're trying to do, you won't marshal the right resources and you won't organize them correctly. And importantly, if you don't have a compelling strategic concept, you cannot convince the policymakers, you cannot convince the Congress, you cannot convince the American people to spend money, to spend resources on a Navy. So as you're devising a strategic concept, as you're building a strategy and thinking about how do you employ naval forces, maritime forces, inclusive of all the sea services, of course, you have to be able to make that case to the public and to the policymakers and say, this is where these resources are best deployed and where we have a decisive advantage. Otherwise, you're just going to lose the budget battle. You're going to lose the policy argument. So that's my one theorist to the public and one theorist to the Navy.
Yes. Excellent, Sam. Thanks. And I can't agree with you more. You know, the Huntington article's still relevant, strategic concept's still relevant, and the Navy is still relevant. So if you look at money that's coming from the Hill, the guys with the purse strings that I talked about, the Navy is going to get about $36 billion in SCN ship construction money. And you look at what they're proposing for the Army, it's about a third of that. And the Air Force is not getting as much money as the Navy. So the Navy is running hot, straight, and normal like a torpedo, leading this pack in the Joint Force. And the battle in the Pacific, as Steve and I and you have said before, is going to be back to an air-sea battle. You know, so, and with the Marine Corps doing forward expeditionary stuff on the islands. So how is maritime strategy adapting to the return of great power competition, the rise of China? I mean, I think Russia is still very dangerous out there. You know, there's been lots of dialogue about Russia and the war in Ukraine. I think the Russians have proven that they're not going to stop there. They're going to move into Europe if they're successful in Ukraine. So we need to do whatever we can as a Navy to prevent that and to blunt that offensive. One of the books I talked about up in Newport was Dr. Bridge Colby's book, The Strategy of Denial. It's all about the Western Pacific. And of course, he is the Undersecretary of Defense Policy. An extremely well-educated man. I'm glad he's there. I think he was a great pick. The Groton School, Harvard, Yale. He's got all the academic credentials, and he's got some experience under his belt in working for General Mattis and being part of that great power competition strategy that came back in 2018 that we all loved. When he was confirmed on the Hill for the latest job as USDP, he said, and I quote, "We stand on the possible precipice of World War III, and we need fundamental change before we ram right into that iceberg." Interesting. Ram right into the iceberg. Another naval analogy. Dr. Colby maintains that the United States will be a cornerstone balancer. He uses that term throughout his book, which is defined as a very powerful state to anchor a coalition which pushes back against malign Chinese influence in the Western Pacific. And who's a member of that coalition? Well, he's got a list. And in no particular order, they are Japan, Australia, Taiwan, who we think is the subject of the Chinese invasion, the Philippines, Vietnam, what a turnaround after the Vietnam War, South Korea, Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, and he talks about the second island cloud, which is a term that Major Pete Ellis used between the First and Second World Wars in mapping out the island campaign in the Pacific, and that would include Micronesia, Melanesia, the Marshall Solomons, Guam, Polynesia, which is a French protectorate. And that's important space for us to maneuver our aircraft carrier strike groups. India doesn't necessarily have to be part of this coalition because India is a pretty big country. They're pretty powerful. And, they may not agree with everything in U.S. policy, but they agree with us on one thing, and that is China is dangerous. And so they're going to be interested in not allowing China to encroach on their interests throughout the Western Pacific and the Indian Ocean. The strategy of denial uses all the elements of DIME to prevent China from getting on the island of Taiwan. And in the event that they do, then Dr. Colby uses the term a binding strategy of this coalition to forcibly eject the Chinese from Taiwan if they get there, and we hope they don't. That to me sounds like an Article 5 in NATO, in the NATO Charter, which is an attack on one's an attack on all, and you've got to respond. We don't have a NATO organization out in the Western Pacific because people's differences are too disparate to be able to afford something to bring these people together and agree on everything. I do agree, and I'm sure Mahan would, on the pivot to the Pacific, which Dr. Colby proposes because of the need for concentration of force. As we said, 400 ships in the Chinese Navy, 300 ships in our Navy. Mahan wrote about this, and he used in his book on naval strategy, which was a compilation of all of his lectures at the Naval War College. He wrote about the Straits of Tsushima, the Russo-Japanese War of 1905, and how the Russians screwed up by splitting their fleet between the Baltic and Asiatic, and they couldn't blunt the offense of the Japanese, and they lost the Asiatic fleet. It was a travesty. So we've got to concentrate force in the Western Pacific. But I wonder, the world gets a vote. Will this pivot become a pirouette? And will we be back someplace else like the next time there's a crisis in the Persian Gulf? There's been 5 carrier strike groups that have transited to the Eastern Mediterranean or to the Arabian Gulf in defense of Israel and our interests in the Middle East since October of 2023. So I don't think we're going to turn our back on Israel. And concentration of force is going to be harder when we're being pulled and tugged by all of these other competing interests. So again, what this establishes is, the chief strategist, the chief policy officer in the Pentagon is thinking about all this. He understands the importance of the Navy and our role out in the Western Pacific. I think there's going to have to be some evolution of thinking, however, on how much force we take, rob from Peter to pay Paul, do we take from other theaters when other theaters have challenges to U.S. national and security interests as well. And, Dr. Colby talks about an idea that he calls differentiated credibility. We need to be more powerful in one region than another. The United States has always been a global power. And so I would like to see a national security strategy, defense strategy, and a maritime strategy that maintains our global interests. We talk about the commons, all over the world. I don't want us to become just a regional power out in the Western Pacific and give up everything else. But it really becomes a matter of money, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what we really need here, my conclusion is we need more Navy. And,
of course.
I'm sure there are others on the Hill that would agree with me on that. Last question and comment, and this one's for you, Steve.
Yeah.
They liked my commentary about your book, Strategy Shelved, because as we've said multiple times, this is up at the War College.
Mm-hmm.
The Naval War College needs to be part and parcel of the development of a future maritime strategy, and the sooner the better. You wrote about this in the tales of the very successful John Layman maritime strategy of 1986. How we got there, how incredibly powerful it was for the staff to come together, coalesce around a strategy, which was extremely successful. Layman writes about it in Oceans Venture, great book. But then we ran into a brick wall. I used the quote from Admiral Kelso in his confirmation hearing in your book that the strategy from 1986 is on the shelf, and a 600 ship Navy is no longer an option. We need more flexible options. So over to you. Tell us that story. So we'll wrap up.
The maritime strategy is a great exercise in how to build an operational level of war strategy for a service. It's got some pitfalls, and we'll briefly hit those too. So the key beginning of all that is Admiral Elmo Zumwalt, who in 1970 realized very quickly that the then rising Soviet Navy was going to be a serious problem for the United States Navy that had spent the last 35 years, like us, supporting operations ashore. Very much what Sam said about the transoceanic Navy concept. What do you do when nobody's got a Navy? Well, the Soviets built a Navy. We responded to it over time. You had people like Zumwalt, Admiral Holloway, and Admiral Hayward who followed, who helped develop operational concepts to do that. At the same time, John Layman is thinking about this very seriously as a consultant to the Navy at that time before he became secretary. And as you said, sir, the War College is thinking about this too. Thinking about how to create some kind of a maritime strategy begins, of course, with Admiral Stansfield Turner writing as a president of the Naval War College and reforming the curriculum to, again, focus on that. And that was important. And we did it. We actually created, you had President Reagan come in, bring Secretary Layman in. That's a pivotal moment. You need presidential support to make any maritime strategy work. And it also worked in terms of the force structure, the accompanying 600 ship Navy, which many then and still today think was unaffordable. Well, that depends. The Cold War ended. That's the key point here. The Cold War ended. Admiral Kelso was forced to accept the fact there was going to be a peace dividend. That was certainly a problem. The Goldwater-Nichols Act of 1986, well intended. Let's make the military more joint, but it took away the ability of the Navy to think about strategy, assuming that all future strategy would be joint and that wars would all look like Gulf War I. They'd all be heroic coalition efforts that we'd have plenty of time to assemble forces for, plenty of time to execute. The bad guys would be rogue states like Saddam or Milosevic in the former Yugoslavia. They'd be easy to deal with. Nobody thought about great power war again. And the Navy lost a strategic concept. It became part of this wider joint mission that will be firepower for the expeditionary force. Well, we're back again to a period where peer war is again possible. As you pointed out, sir, it's going to be an air-sea battle based alone on the geography. Mm-hmm. That ought to define who is the...
work talked about that too.
Absolutely. And that ought to define...
Geography is important.
Yes. That ought to define who's the supported services out there. So in this case, probably the Navy and the Air Force with supporting forces coming from the Army. The Army is essential to this mission as well. It's going to be a joint fight, whatever it is. So what Sam said about J.C. Wiley's book looks at it from a joint perspective. He ought to be in the pantheon along with Mahan and Corbett because he brings it all together. Mahan and Corbett aren't thinking joint. They exist in a world before joint. Wiley at least thinks about all the services working together and how they can execute a war plan. So what you said, sir, about the strategic concept is important. the force we designed to execute the strategic concept. And finally, your point about John Layman, it's the exercises that matter.
Ocean's Venture, full.
What does it look like? You have to demonstrate to your opponent that this matters. A couple of years ago, Peter Schwartz, and I'll end it with this, Peter Schwartz brought to my attention a document that the CIA had recently released from 1995, and they'd questioned former Soviet military leaders in that brief period of light, between 1990 and when Putin took over. And they asked questions about, what was important in terms of the West. And many Soviet leaders said over and over again, you surrounded us. We were surrounded by American and Allied forces everywhere. And that those
were the days.
And that the kind of exercises that John Layman writes about that took place in the North Atlantic and the High North with submarines, aircraft carriers, shook the Soviets because they didn't think that we could come up there and operate. And if you really want to watch this, the 1980s in action, there's a great C-SPAN video. You can look at it right now. It's the 17 March 1987 two-carrier buy hearing in the Senate Armed Services Committee. And you've got John Layman testifying. You've got Hammer and Hank Mustin, who's standing in for the CNO, who's a very grouchy Cold War admiral, who talks about operating in the high north and how difficult that is. And it really gives you a feel into how maritime strategy, 600-ship Navy, block buys, how it all comes together. And it's worth your look. And the War College is a key part of all of this because they're the intellectual center that helps drive this.
Thanks, Steve. Thinking about the good old days, 600 ships and surrounding the Soviet Navy, that reminded me of one of my favorite quotes. I used to use it all the time when I was in the European theater on active duty, and that was General Patton calling in to General Creighton Abrams, thinking of the Battle of the Bulge, and saying, "Hey, Creighton, how's it going today?" And this is in the midst, or this is in the context of the U.S. Navy and our pivot to the Pacific. And General Abrams responded, "Well, sir, they got us surrounded. The poor bastards." And that's American tenacity right there. So that will prevail. Sam, last word to you. What do you take away from this discussion today? What are our kind of top three things that stick in your mind?
Sure. So a couple things. I think first and foremost, going back to our discussion at the beginning, how you think about these things matters. And it's not just a question of, having the best technology or having the right resources or more resources than an adversary. We've been in this world for, my whole life since, going back really, I think, to the fall of the Soviet Union, where we haven't had to think about how we think about military problems and strategic problems because we've kind of stood head and shoulders above everybody. And anytime there was a problem, we thought, okay, we have better technology and we have more of everything. So we can just overwhelm the enemy. And that's, that's all well and good when you can do it, but it doesn't work when you can't do it. And I think we're back into a world where, the margins are probably still in our favor, but a lot narrower. And so we'd better start getting back to thinking again. And so I think it's really important for people. I know it seems esoteric, and I get on my hobby horse about this. You both know, around the office I do this, that the strategic theory really does matter. And approaching this as, studying deeply and thinking deeply, how have these great intellectuals thought about the same type of problem? Not because there's somewhere to reach up into the cloud of their ideas and pull down the maxim that we apply that will solve our problems. That doesn't really work, but you have to do the work of reading and thinking and contemplating to hone your own mind, both people individually, but kind of the leadership in the Pentagon and elsewhere, to hone the strategic instinct and to really bring that back. The other thing I would really commend people to do is think about how the situation and the challenge with China is different from the 20th century, different from the challenge that we faced with the Soviet Union, with Imperial Japan, Nazi Germany. There are useful historical analogies to be drawn there. I don't want to totally dismiss that, but we have this idea of it's very common to say, oh, we're in a new Cold War with China. It's like, well, that can be helpful to motivate people or give people a sense of scale, but it's qualitatively, there are a lot of differences that buries. Like I was talking earlier about, Chinese, significant investments in the commercial maritime industry, control of a significant portion of global, the physical movement of global trade. That's something that has no analogy in the Soviet Union, when they're kind of the elephant and we're the whale out at sea that can kind of jump onto land wherever we want and push them back. So think about how it's different and explore other analogies throughout history. I think at least one that's useful to think about in the U.S.-China competition is Britain and France in the 18th century, where we have a long-running competition. It involves several wars, several coalition wars that hopefully we can avoid. But the idea of a primarily land power, but that's also a major sea power, primarily a sea power that has a coalition of allies, that a constellation that it kind of brings together to constrain its rival. I think there's a lot to be seen in that analogy and a lot of other analogies from kind of pre-Napoleonic Europe, great power competition and economic competition and colonial competition in the kind of 16th, 17th, 18th centuries. Don't go back to the Cold War books. We all know the Cold War. Go dig something new up and come up with a new good analogy, and hopefully we'll have a new angle on the problem.
Outstanding. Well, folks, that's a wrap. Thank you to Dr. Steve Wills and Sam Byers for joining me for Maritime Nation today. I'd like to thank our listeners for joining us each month. If you haven't heard our previous episodes, you can always catch up on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Episodes and all content described here today can be found on our new website, www.centerformaritimestrategy.org, all lowercase. And thanks to Dataminr for the sponsorship and support, and to our sound engineer, Mr. Peterson, always faithful. Stay tuned for the next episode of Maritime Nation. Thank you.